Most people think saving a life is gentle. This was no gentle act. To save a man shot in the femoral artery, you have to be crueler than the bullet. You have to dig your fingers into the torn meat, find the hose that's spraying his life away, and pinch it shut against the bone until you feel the pulse struggle and die under your grip. The sound arrived before the pain registered. A wet, heavy thwack, like a butcher slamming a cleaver into a side of beef, cut through the howling wind. The noise signaled high-velocity lead hitting fluid-filled tissue. Javi Vegas, Soto didn't fall. He collapsed structurally. Gravity took him instantly. His left leg buckled, the nervous system short-circuiting, and his 200 pounds of combat load slammed into the frozen shale with the dull thud of dead weight. I didn't wait for the crack of the gunshot. By the time the sonic boom reached us, a sharp crack thump echoing off the valley walls, I was already moving. I grabbed his drag handle. The physics were brutal. The snow wasn't just powder, it was waist-deep concrete waiting to set. I drove my boots into the ice, leaning back, using my skeleton as a lever to haul him behind a jagged spine of black rock. The air tasted of ozone and the copper tang of aerosolized blood. I went by Rook on missions, my call sign. Off-duty, it was Thorn, my real name. Over the radio, Bravo 6 marked our net call. Rook Vegas screamed. The scream tore raw from his throat. Leg. My leg? I didn't look at his face. Eye contact is for comfort. I needed data. I looked at the snow. It was turning black. Fast. A dark, steaming stain was spreading out from under his left thigh, melting the ice on contact. The femoral artery is a high-pressure pipe. You have 3 minutes before the tank runs dry. Maybe less in this cold. I ripped the IFAK pouch off his vest, the Velcro tearing with a violence that sounded deafening in the sudden micro-silence between wind gusts. I stripped my gloves off. The cold hit my hands instantly. A physical blow, like slamming them in a car door. 30 below zero. The wind chill was trying to turn the water in my cells into crystals. I had 60 seconds of fine motor control before my fingers turned to wood, banks. "Security," I yelled. My voice felt small, swallowed instantly by the gale. Sergeant Major, Preacher, Banks was already working the problem. I could feel the percussion of his suppressed carbine through the ground, rhythmic, controlled bursts. The carbine coughed muffled reports. He wasn't panic firing. He was counting rounds, buying us seconds with lead currency. I grabbed the Celox gauze. I didn't hesitate. I jammed my naked fingers into the wound channel. It was warm inside, a sickening, intimate contrast to the biting wind. The blood was slick, pumping against my palm with the hydraulic force of a failing engine. Vegas arched his back, his spine bowing off the ground. A guttural sound escaped his clenched teeth, vibrating through his chest into my hand. The Celox hit the blood. Chemistry took over. An exothermic reaction. Heat bloomed like a flare burning under the skin. It burned. It cauterized. It felt like I was shoving a live coal into raw steak. "Breathe," I growled, shifting my center of gravity to drive my knee into his groin, pinning the artery. "Don't you quit on me, Javi. Breathe." My knuckles were white against his blood-soaked fatigues. The heat from the chemical reaction radiated up my forearm, tricking my nerves, but the rest of me was freezing. The wind flayed the skin on my cheeks, stripping away the moisture. I could feel the adrenaline dumping into my system, a cold chemical bath that sharpened my vision but made my hands shake. I needed nicotine. I needed to center the chaotic variables. My jaw ached from clenching it, chewing on nothing but stress. I held the pressure. 1 minute. The longest minute in the world. The flow slowed. The black stain stopped spreading. "Talk to me," Rook Vegas rasped. His eyes were rolling back, white showing in the gloom. Shock was setting in, the body pulling blood from the extremities to save the core. "Tell me we're good, I lied. The lie tasted like bile. I reached for the radio handset with my free hand. My fingers were stiff, responding with a agonizing delay. I keyed the mic. Dust off. Dust off. This is Bravo 6. Taking heavy fire. One urgent surgical. Grid reference. Silence. No static. No crackle of atmospheric interference. Just a hiss. A rhythmic, electronic hiss. It pulsed like a synthetic heartbeat. Precise. Mathematical. This was a generated waveform. I keyed it again. Dust off. Acknowledge. Hiss. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, pushing against my collar. This wasn't bad terrain. This wasn't a dead battery. I looked at the handset, analyzing the display. No signal bars, just a flat line of noise. I looked up at Banks. He had stopped firing. He was looking at me, his tactical goggles reflecting the gray void of the storm. He heard it too. The lack of response was louder than the gunfire. "That's not weather," Banks said. His voice was flat, stripped of hope. He knew the tech. "No," I said, releasing the button. I tapped the stock of my rifle. Tap, tap, tap. A nervous tick I couldn't shake. A physical metronome trying to find order in the chaos. That's active jamming. The realization hit me harder than the cold. Someone was blocking the distress net. Someone with serious hardware. Someone who knew exactly where we were and what frequency we used. We weren't just pinned down in a kill box on Christmas Eve. We were being erased. We had to move. The rock shelf offered cover from the direct fire, but the cold was a second enemy, a quieter assassin flanking us from every side. Vegas was stabilizing, but the shock had turned him into heavy, dead weight. His body was shutting down, pulling blood from the surface to protect the vital organs, turning him into 200 pounds of wet sandbag. "Up," I said. This was a mechanical command to my own failing muscles. I grabbed Vegas by the drag handle of his plate carrier. Banks took the legs, keeping low, his profile minimizing the target area. We heaved. The physics were punishing. Vegas didn't help. He couldn't. We were dragging him through thigh-deep powder that acted like friction paste. Every step was a battle against Newton's laws. My lungs burned with the intake of freezing air, each breath feeling like swallowing crushed glass. The cold didn't just chill, it restricted oxygen exchange. My fingers, still bare from the medical work, were beyond numb. They felt like blocks of wood attached to my wrists by rusty hinges. I tried to flex them, to force blood back into the capillaries, but the response was sluggish. A half-second delay between thought and action. The tactile feedback was gone. I was operating my hands by sight, not sensation. We made 10 yards, 20. Then we collapsed behind a ridge of granite, lungs heaving. I checked my rifle. It was a compulsion, a mental anchor in the chaos. Tap, tap, check. Bolt forward. Dust cover closed. Selector on safe. My hands moved on muscle memory alone, bypassing the frozen nerves. It was a ritual of control. If the weapon works, I work. "How's the leg?" Banks asked, scanning the ridgeline. His voice was tight, the professional calm stretching thin over the adrenaline. I looked down. The Celox dressing was holding, a hard, crusty patch against the torn fabric of Vegas's pants. But the surrounding skin was pale, waxy. The heat from the chemical burn had faded, replaced by the creeping gray of frostbite. The contrast was sickening. Burnt flesh and frozen skin side by side. Bleeding stopped, I said, but he's losing heat fast. We need to get him off this mountain. I reached into my pocket, my clumsy fingers fumbling with the foil wrapper. Nicotine gum. The foil crinkled loudly, a sharp metallic sound in the wind. I shoved the square into my mouth, chewing aggressively. The sharp peppermint bite flooded my senses, a chemical slap to the brain that gave me a moment of artificial clarity. I needed that edge. I needed to think faster than the cold. I reached for the radio again. Maybe the jammer had drifted. Maybe we were out of the electronic shadow. I keyed the mic, watching the display. Hiss. The same rhythm. The same synthetic pulse. It was stronger now. Louder. The signal strength meter didn't move for voice, but the interference bar was maxed out. They're tracking us, I said. I didn't yell. I stated it as a data point. Whoever is jamming us, they're closing the net. They're using the signal strength to triangulation our position. Banks looked at the ridge above us. The whiteout was thinning just enough to reveal shapes moving in the gray distance. Shadows detaching from the rock face. I analyzed their movement. They weren't rushing. They were moving with disciplined spacing, keeping intervals, using the terrain. Pros, they're not just suppressing us. Rook, Banks said. He pointed a gloved finger to the east, where the terrain sloped upward. They're flanking. They're compressing the box. I followed his line of sight. He was right. The enemy fire wasn't random anymore. It was hurting us. They were denying us the high ground, pushing us toward the sheer drop on the west side. It was a classic L-shaped ambush, scaled up to the size of a mountain. Killbox, I muttered. The term tasted like ash. They're squeezing us into the killbox. Vegas shivered violently against me, his teeth chattering with a sound like dice rattling in a plastic cup. Cold, he mumbled, his voice slurring. So? Cold. I pulled him tighter, sharing what little body heat I had left. It was a futile gesture. Thermodynamics, fighting a losing war against the storm. But my eyes were on the ridgeline. The shadows were getting closer. And for the first time, I saw the glint of optics, the purple reflection of anti-reflective coating on a scope lens. They're setting up a crossfire, I said, realizing the tactical geometry too late. We were the bait, and the trap was snapping shut. We have to move. Now Banks shifted his aim, bringing his muzzle up. But then I saw him hesitate. He froze. He lowered his rifle a fraction of an inch. Breaking the firing solution, Rook, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the wind. Look at 3 o'clock. High ground. The overhang. I turned, my neck muscles screaming at the tension. A single figure stood on the overhang, silhouetted against the gray sky. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't in a firing stance. It was just watching us. I analyzed the silhouette, wrapped in rags. Bulky. Indistinguishable. But the posture wasn't aggressive. And then the figure raised a rifle. My heart hammered against my ribs. But the barrel didn't point at us. It pointed parallel to us, pointing back at the way we came, pointing at the hunters. It was an invitation. Or a warning. The wind had a voice now. It was a physical thing. A solid wall of freezing air that swallowed the world beyond 10 meters. But inside the kill box, the soundscape was terrifyingly clear. I could hear the crunch of boots on shale above us. The enemy wasn't running. They were walking. That's how confident they were. They knew the geometry. We were pinned against the drop, carrying a man who was already half dead, with our communications jammed by a signal that felt like a localized eclipse. I scanned the ridgeline again, my eyes watering from the cold. The silhouette on the overhang was gone, vanished like a hallucination. Had I seen it? Or was the hypoxia playing tricks on my brain? It didn't matter. The threat was in front of us. Movement. 12 o'clock high, Banks hissed. They're committing. He was right. 3 shapes detached themselves from the gray curtain of the storm. They were moving down the slope, weapons raised. They had the high ground. They had the numbers. And they had us cold. I checked my magazine. Half empty. I didn't have enough lead to win a firefight, and I certainly didn't have enough to suppress a flanking maneuver. The point man on the ridge stopped. He wasn't the shooter. He was the RTO, radio telephone operator. I saw the long whip antenna trembling in the wind above his pack. He was raising a handset to his face, calling in the final coordinates. He was the most dangerous man on the mountain. If he spoke, mortars would turn this shelf into a gravel pit. Drop him, I ordered, shifting my aim. But before I could pull the trigger, the mountain spoke for me. Crack. This was a sharp, singular, and authoritative high-velocity snap that arrived milliseconds before the sound of the rifle. The RTO's head snapped back violently, a mist of pink spraying against the white snow. He dropped instantly, his body folding like a wet towel. The handset dangled from its cord, swinging in the wind. Thump. The report arrived a full second later. Deep, resonant, swallowed by the gale, but unmistakable. It didn't come from us. It came from the west, from the overhang, from the impossible angle. Panic rippled through the enemy squad, but it was confused panic. They spun around, weapons searching, but they looked east. They were firing into the empty rock face on the opposite side of the valley. Crack thump. Another enemy gunman dropped, clutching his chest. He fell forward, sliding down the scree slope. The enemy was shooting at ghosts. They were victims of echo masking, a sniper's oldest ally in this terrain. The valley walls bounced the sonic boom, throwing the sound so it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shooter was using the geology as a suppressor. I watched the tracers fly wild into the wrong rocks. It was beautiful. It was surgical. And then I heard it. The cadence. Crack. Pause. Crack. This was a rhythm. A heartbeat. I knew that rhythm. I'd heard it on ranges in Virginia and on rooftops in Fallujah. It was a signature, as unique as a fingerprint. The remaining enemy fighters broke contact. They didn't know where the fire was coming from, so they chose the only option left: retreat. They scrambled back up the ridge, disappearing into the whiteout, leaving 2 bodies cooling in the snow. Silence returned to the shelf. A heavy, ringing silence. Banks lowered his rifle, staring up at the overhang where the shots had originated. "Who the hell is that?" he whispered. "Friendly, no," I said, the realization hitting me colder than the wind, not friendly. Family. I knew that cadence. I knew the specific delay between target acquisition and trigger break. It was a ghost story I had told myself was over. "Let's move," I said, grabbing Vegas's drag handle again before she disappears again, because that was the thing about ghosts. They didn't stay visible for long. And this one had just saved our lives with a rifle she wasn't supposed to have, in a place she wasn't supposed to be. The climb up the scree slope was agony. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Vegas was a dead-weight anchor, dragging us back, his boots leaving twin furrows in the snow that filled instantly with drift. My lungs burned with a chemical heat, and the cold air turning to acid in my chest. But we pushed. We pushed because the alternative was freezing to death in a kill box that was temporarily clear. We crested the ridge into the teeth of the gale. The wind here was a physical assault, screaming at 60 miles an hour, stripping the heat from our bodies in seconds. And there she was. She was huddled in the lee of a boulder, wrapped in layers of filthy, mismatched rags that blended perfectly with the gray granite. She didn't look like a savior. She looked like wreckage. I heard her before I saw her face. Avet, rattling wheeze that cut through the wind noise. It was the sound of lungs fighting for every cubic centimeter of air. Hypothermia and pneumonia fighting a war inside a human chest. I signaled Banks to hold security. I approached her slowly, the weapon lowered but ready. She didn't turn. She was busy. Her hands were moving over the bolt of a long rifle, then a beat-up .338 that looked like it had been salvaged from a scrap heap. I focused on her hands. They were a ruin. Her gloves were gone. The fingers were wrapped in black tactical tape, layer upon layer of it. The tape edges were lifting and cracking with frost, revealing skin underneath that was pale, waxy, and dead. Glossy black plastic against corpse-white flesh. It was a miracle. She could feel the trigger, let alone pull it with that kind of precision. She shivered. Not a tremble. But à violent, racking convulsion that shook her entire frame. She was in the final stages, the stage where the body stops trying to save itself and just starts shutting down the lights. Lena? I said. The name felt heavy on my tongue. She stopped working the bolt. She turned her head slowly. Her face was a map of frostbite scars and windburn. Her eyes were deep pits of exhaustion, but the spark in them was hard, unbroken. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. There was no hug, no Hollywood reunion. She reached into the folds of her rags. Her taped fingers fumbled for a second, the dexterity gone, before she pulled out a small, rectangular object, a hard drive, ruggedized, matte, black. She held it out to me. Her hand was shaking so bad the drive vibrated in the air. I saw you buried in Arlington. I said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of a fact that was now a lie. She stared at me, her teeth chattering so hard the words were chopped into staccato bursts. Empty box? She wheezed. Give me .338. It was a trade. Information for ammunition. Her life for the mission. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was asking for the tools to finish the job. I took the drive. It was warm. Body heat. She had been keeping it close to her core, protecting it more than her own fingers. The transfer was physical. I felt the weight of the black plastic in my palm. It wasn't just data. It was the reason she was dying on this mountain. It was the reason we had been jammed. It was the reason the RTO had been calling in mortars. I looked at the drive, then back at her. She was already turning back to the valley, her eyes scanning for targets we couldn't see yet. She was a weapon that had been fired and forgotten, but she was still traveling down range. We have a bird coming, I said. Stuff is inbound. She froze. She looked at me again, and for the first time, fear flickered behind the exhaustion. Real fear. No bird, she rasped. Not for me. I looked at the drive in my hand. Then I looked at Vegas, bleeding out in the snow behind me. And then I looked at the sky, where the heavy thump, thump, thump of rotors was just beginning to bleed into the wind noise. If she was dead on paper, and we were holding the thing that killed her, then rescue wasn't coming. Something else was. I had my hand on the drive when the radio crackled. It wasn't a clear signal. It punched through the jamming layer with a distortion that felt wrong. Too powerful, too clean at the edges. It didn't fade in. It arrived with the sudden, blunt force of a breach charge. Bravo 6. This is Recovery 1. Inbound your location. ETA 2 mics. Pop smoke. I stared at the handset in my frozen glove. Recovery 1. Not the stuff. Not Angel. Recovery. The term sat in my gut like a stone swallowed whole. In the teams, you recover equipment. You recover sensitive items. You recover bodies. You rescue men. The semantic difference was microscopic to a civilian, but in the military, language is doctrine, and doctrine dictates priority. Recovery implies an object, not a pulse. Did you hear that? Banks asked. He wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking at me, his eyes narrowing behind his goggles. He caught the terminology shift. I heard it. I said. The jamming hiss under the voice transmission didn't stop. It just dipped in volume, a calculated attenuation, like someone had turned a dial down to let the message through, then turned it back up. Hiss. The electronic heartbeat was still there. Active. Controlled. If this was a friendly bird coming to save us, why were they still jamming our distress net? Why were they blinding us until the last second? We popped the smoke. I pulled the pin on the M18 canister, the spoon flying off with a metallic ping lost in the wind. Red-violet smoke hissed out, instantly whipped flat by the gale, painting the snow in a long, bloody streak that pointed nowhere. It didn't rise. The air pressure smashed it against the rock. I checked Vegas. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid, shock spiraling into terminal failure. The cold had done what the bullet couldn't. It had shut down his shivering reflex. Birds coming, I told him, leaning close to his ear, though he couldn't hear me. Stay with it. Kovic didn't move. She was still scanning the valley, her .338 resting on a rock ledge, her body a rigid sculpture of rags and ice. She hadn't reacted to the radio call. She hadn't looked up. She was waiting for something else. Wraith, I said, my voice cutting through the wind. We need to move to the LZ. She turned her head slowly, the movement stiff, mechanical. Her eyes, sunken and dark, locked onto mine with a terrifying clarity. She tapped her headset with a taped finger. Authentication, she wheezed. The word was a struggle. Did they authenticate? I froze. She was right. The voice on the radio hadn't asked for a challenge and password. They hadn't asked for the number of wounded. They just announced their arrival. That wasn't sloppy. That was arrogant. That was the confidence of a team that didn't need to check if we were friendlies, because they knew exactly what we were. The sound of rotors bled into the wind. Heavy, rhythmic. Whump, whump, whump. This was the deep, percussive throb of heavy lift blades cutting dense air. I stood up, shielding my eyes against the stinging ice. The dark shape of a helicopter materialized out of the whiteout, sliding sideways through the air, currents like a shark in murky water. It was a Black Hawk, but modified. No Red Cross markings. No unit numbers. Just matte black paint. Radar-absorbent coating that seemed to suck the little light that was left out of the valley. It flared for landing, the rotor wash hitting us like a physical blow. It drove ice crystals into every exposed inch of skin, sandblasting my face. The pressure change popped my ears. Banks, get Vegas ready. I yelled over the noise, but I didn't move to help. My feet were rooted to the shale. I was watching the bird. I was looking for the PJs, the parascumen. I was looking for the bright orange litters, I was looking for the chaos of a medical extraction. Instead, the side door slid open with a heavy mechanical clunk. 4 men stepped out. They didn't jump. They stepped. Controlled. Precise. They weren't wearing flight suits. They were in multicam black, the uniform of direct action, not rescue. They didn't have medical kits. They had rifles raised, and on their belts, dangling like plastic jewelry in the wind, I saw the white loops of flex cuffs. Flex cuffs. For a rescue mission. My hand drifted to the safety of my rifle. It was a subconscious move, a reflex born of 10 years in bad places. You don't handcuff survivors. You handcuff prisoners. The lead man walked toward us. He moved with the fluid aggression of a Tier 1 operator, knees bent, weapon tight, eyes scanning sectors. He stopped 5 meters away, his face hidden behind a ballistic mask and quad-tube night vision goggles that made him look like a giant insect staring at prey. He didn't look at Vegas. He didn't look at the blood on the snow. He looked straight at me. He tapped his headset. His voice projected through an external speaker. Smooth. Nasal. The voice of a man reading a spreadsheet, not a battlefield commander. Recovery 1 on deck. He said, identify the asset. Acid. Not survivor. Not wounded. Not troops in contact. The word hung in the freezing air between us, heavy and absolute. It was, austerely, corporate noun. It was the final nail in the coffin of my hope. The rotor wash was a sandblaster. It scoured the shelf, stripping the top layer of loose powder and firing it horizontally at 80 miles an hour. I squinted against the grit, my eyelashes collecting ice, my vision reduced to a tunnel. But inside that tunnel, the details were screaming at me. The men in black didn't fan out to secure a perimeter for a medical evac. They didn't check the corners. They formed a semicircle around us, a containment ring. Their weapons, short-barreled carbines with expensive optics, weren't pointed outward at the valley to protect us. They were at the low, ready, muzzles drifting toward us. I looked at their gear. It was clean. Too clean. Plate carriers slick with ice but no mud. No medic patches. No tourniquets rubber banded to their kits for quick access. And dangling from the lead man's hip, a black nylon bag. I knew that bag. It wasn't a medical bag. It was a hood bag. The kind we used for high-value detainees during extraordinary rendition. Check fire, I said to Banks, my voice barely audible over the engine's scream. Check your background. Banks had seen it too. He had stepped between the newcomers in Vegas, his body language shifting from the relaxed posture of relief to a coiled, defensive crouch. He knew. The ridgeline loomed 20 meters north, a jagged barrier of rock and ice providing partial cover from the east flank. The lead man, Mercer, stepped closer. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The external speaker on his vest amplified his voice, cutting through the mechanical roar with terrifying clarity. It was a voice designed to give orders in air-conditioned rooms. Status report, Mercer said. He stood relaxed, hands resting on his weapon, radiating a cold, bureaucratic indifference to the dying man behind me. We have one urgent surgical, I yelled, pointing at Vegas. Femoral bleed. He needs immediate transport. He has maybe 10 minutes. Mercer didn't even glance at Vegas. He didn't blink. His insect eyes, the 4 glowing blue lenses of his GPN VG-18s, swiveled to Kovic. She was slumped against the rock, looking like a pile of rags. "Is that the package?" Mercer asked. "Package. First asset. Now, package." The dehumanization was systematic. "That is a United States service member?" I said, stepping into his line of sight, blocking his view of her. "And we have a man bleeding out." "Massa Sahil." I heard it over the speaker. A short, static burst of impatience. He reached into a pouch on his chest rig. I tensed, my thumb finding the fire selector on my rifle. Expecting a weapon, he pulled out a scanner, a biometric handheld. He walked past me. He didn't push me. He just moved as if I didn't exist, as if I were furniture in a room he owned. He walked straight to Kovic. He pointed the scanner at her face. A red laser grid mapped her frostbitten features, tracing the contours of her scars. The device beeped. A cheerful, affirmative chirp that sounded obscene in the killing cold. "Identity confirmed," Mercer said to the air. "Asset secure." Then, and only then, did he turn to me. "Where is the drive?" he asked. The question hit me harder than the cold. He knew about the drive. He knew who she was. And he hadn't asked about Vegas once. He hadn't asked about the ambush. He hadn't asked if we were okay. I looked at the flex cuffs on his belt, swinging like pendulums. I looked at the black bag, and I looked at the weapons his team was holding. Safeties off, fingers indexed on trigger guards. This wasn't a rescue. This was a collection, and we were the loose ends that needed to be tied off. I felt the drive in my pocket. It felt hot, like a coal, burning through my pants leg. It was the only leverage we had. "The drive is secure," I said, my hand hovering near my holster. "After we load the wounded." Mercer stopped. He tilted his head slightly, like a bird studying a worm. The blue lenses stared at me, unblinking, unfeeling. "There are no wounded," Mercer said. His voice was smooth, devoid of malice, stating a simple administrative fact. "The manifest lists 0 survivors." He gestured to his men. 2 of them stepped forward, not toward Kovic, but toward Vegas. One of them pulled a zip tie from his belt, not to bind him, to tag him. "Secure the asset," Mercer ordered. "Sanitize the rest." The priority was absolute. The asset was the hardware. The rest of us, the living, breathing men who had bled for it, were just trash to be swept away. A sanitation issue. I looked at Banks. He nodded. A micro movement. I gripped the pistol in my holster. "Wrong answer," I whispered. The words hung in the air, frozen like the breath in front of Mercer's mask. Sanitize the site? It wasn't a combat order. It was a janitorial instruction. The absolute, clinical indifference of it hit me harder than the cold. He wasn't just killing us. He was erasing a mistake on a spreadsheet. I didn't argue. You don't argue with a man who has already categorized you as waste. I looked at Banks. He was coiled, his weight on his back foot, his eyes locked on the cleaner closest to Vegas. The cleaner was reaching for a zip tie, his weapon dangling on its sling. A fatal error. I didn't speak. I moved my left hand, the one not hovering over my pistol. I tapped my chest twice, then slashed the air horizontally. Execute. All targets. It was a small movement, almost lost in the violent shudder of the rotor wash, but Banks saw it. The transition from negotiation to violence is a physical threshold. It has a sound. Banks moved first. He didn't raise his rifle. He was too close. He drove the muzzle of his carbine into the cleaner's gut, a piston-like jab that folded the man in half. Thump. The sound of the impact was dull. Vet. The cleaner gasped, the air rushing out of his lungs into the microphone of his headset, broadcasting his pain to the entire team. Idref. My pistol cleared the holster. The friction of Kydex against polymer was a familiar scratch in the chaos. I didn't aim for Mercer's head. He was wearing a ballistic mask. I aimed for the pelvic girdle, the unarmored hinge that connects the legs to the spine. Mercer was fast. He saw the draw. He twisted, bringing his own weapon up, but the geometry of the close range favored the man who had already decided to kill. Crack, crack. My double tap was deafening inside the containment ring. The muzzle flash bloomed like a strobe light in the whiteout, a sudden, blinding star that burned the retina. The first round hit Mercer's thigh, just below the plate carrier. The second hit the same spot. Physics took over. His leg kicked out from under him, the bones shattering under the hydrostatic shock. He went down, not with a scream, but with a grunt of surprised rage. Then the world exploded. The other cleaners opened fire. But they were reactive. They were shooting at movement, at shadows. The whiteout, which had been our enemy, suddenly became our armor. The muzzle flashes strobe lit the swirling snow, turning the shelf into a disorienting hall of mirrors. You couldn't tell friend from foe. You could only see the muzzle blasts. Crack thump. Crack thump. Suppressed fire from the cleaners mixed with the unsuppressed roar of our weapons. Rounds sparked off the rock, sending stone splinters flying like shrapnel. I grabbed Vegas's drag handle with my free hand. Move! I roared, the word tearing my throat raw. We weren't winning. We were just surviving the first 3 seconds. The cleaners had superior numbers, superior gear, and they were fresh. We were battered, freezing, and carrying a dying man. I fired blindly into the gray curtain, suppressing the shapes that were trying to flank us. I couldn't see Banks. I couldn't see Kovic. I could only hear the crack thump of her .338 from the rocks, a heavy, rhythmic hammer that was punching holes in the enemy's discipline. We scrambled backward, away from the bird, away from the kill zone, dragging Vegas into the deep snow. The wind screamed, mixing with the rotor wash and the gunfire until the noise was a solid wall of pressure. The war had flipped. It wasn't us against the Taliban anymore. It was us against the machine. And the machine was angry. I thought about Banks and his family waiting stateside, a wife and kids in Virginia, the personal stake that made this betrayal cut deeper. The withdrawal was a nightmare of friction and resistance. The snow wasn't just deep. It was adhesive. It clung to Vegas's body, adding pounds of drag to every step. My legs burned with lactic acid, the muscles trembling on the edge of failure. We hit the edge of the shelf, where the ground sloped sharply down into the storm. Pop smoke. Banks yelled from somewhere to my left. I grabbed my last canister, M18 Violet. I pulled the pin and threw it short, right between us and the muzzle flashes. The smoke bloomed instantly, but in the gale force wind, it didn't form a wall. It tore apart, mixing with the spindrift to create a chaotic, purple-gray soup. Visibility collapsed to 0. I couldn't see 5 meters. I couldn't see the helicopter. I could only see the tracers cutting through the fog like angry hornets. The steep slope dropped 15 meters west, a treacherous slide of loose shale under the snowpack. The cleaners were regrouping. I could hear Mercer's voice over the external speakers, distorted by pain but still commanding. Push left. Flank them. Pin them against the drop. They were aggressive. They knew we were hurt. They knew we were slow. Kovic was waiting for us at the boulder. She looked like a corpse that had refused to lie down. Her face was a mask of frozen blood and snot. She was trembling so violently that the rifle barrel was shaking in circles. She looked at the helicopter. The pilot was spooling up, the rotors biting into the air, preparing to lift off and hunt us from above. If that bird got airborne, we were dead. The thermal optics would pick us out of the snow like candles in a dark room. Lena, I said, can you hit it? She didn't answer. She took a breath. Alum, rattling inhalation that sounded like a death rattle. She forced her body to stop shaking for one heartbeat. It wasn't skill anymore. It was will. She was spending the last of her energy currency. She squeezed the trigger. Boom. The .338 didn't crack. It roared. The round didn't hit the pilot. The glass was armored. She knew that. She went for the mechanics. The bullet slammed into the tail rotor assembly, the delicate, spinning gearbox that kept the machine from spinning out of control. There was a screech of tearing metal. Sparks showered down like fireworks. The helicopter lurched violently, the tail slewing to the right. The pilot fought the cyclic, the engine screaming as the turbine over-torqued. It didn't crash, but it couldn't fly. It hovered awkwardly, spinning slowly, forced to set back down hard on the skids. Move, Banks said. His voice was flat. Now. We didn't wait to see if it burned. We used the confusion. We threw ourselves over the edge of the slope, sliding, stumbling, falling into the white void of the valley floor. We slid for 100 meters, a tangle of limbs and gear and snow. When we stopped, we were buried in a drift, lungs heaving, hearts hammering against our ribs. I looked back up the slope. The purple smoke was fading. The sound of the helicopter engine had changed to a high-pitched whine of distress, but the gunfire hadn't stopped. They were still coming. Mercer wouldn't stop. He couldn't. We had the drive. We had the proof. I checked Vegas. He was still alive, but barely. His skin was the color of the snow. We're clear. Banks rasped, wiping blood from his nose. No, I said, looking at the dark shapes moving on the ridge line above us. We're not clear. We're just loose. We turned into the wind, shoulders hunched, and began to walk. We vanished into the storm, leaving a trail of blood that the snow would cover in minutes. We were ghosts now, and ghosts have nowhere to go but the cold. The night stretched ahead, a 4-hour slog through knee-deep drifts to the safe house, with Vegas's condition worsening under the relentless sub-zero chill. The safe house was a rusted corrugated box on the wrong side of the border. It didn't smell like safety. It smelled of kerosene, dead flies, and the copper tang of drying blood that had soaked into the unfinished floorboards. The heater in the corner ticked like a cooling engine, a rhythmic metallic ping that marked the passing of time we didn't have. I sat on a crate, the only furniture that wasn't broken. In my hand was a standard issue DD Form 1380, a field medical card. The paper felt thin, fibrous, and cheap against my calloused thumb. I wasn't filling it out for a patient. I was filling it out for a ghost. Name? Unknown female. Status. Local asset. / deceased. Injury. Blast, trauma. / unidentifiable. I wrote the lie in block letters using a black ballpoint pen. The ink was cheap. It bled slightly into the cardstock, turning the letters fuzzy at the edges. I pressed down hard, etching the deception into the fiber. I attached the tag to a body bag we had pulled from the emergency cache. It was heavy, filled not with the body, but with rocks and snow we had shoveled in 10 minutes ago. This was the MIS-ID protocol. It wasn't combat. It was administration. We weren't just running. We were erasing the trail using the enemy's own bureaucracy against them. If Mercer's team found a body tagged as local collateral damage, it would force a DNA hold. It might buy us 12 hours. 12 hours to disappear into the noise. I capped the pen. The click sounded like a gunshot in the small room. I looked across the space to assess the combat effectiveness of my unit. The data was bad. Vegas was unconscious on a canvas cot, his leg elevated on a stack of ammo cans. The bleeding had stopped, sealed by the chemical cauterization in the cold, but his skin was the color of old parchment, translucent and yellow. His chest rose and fell in a shallow, hitching rhythm. He was alive, but the femoral hit had taken something from him that surgery wouldn't put back. He was no longer an operator. It was cargo. Wraith sat by the window, staring through a crack in the rusted shutter. She hadn't spoken since we cleared the ridge. She was cleaning her rifle, her hands moving with a slow, agonizing stiffness. I watched her fingers. They were wrapped in fresh black tape, but the movement was jerky, rusted. She winced every time she worked the bolt, a micro flinch that tightened the scar tissue on her face. The smell of CLP solvent drifted through the kerosene stench, sharp and chemical. She ran a taped hand over the stock, then stared blankly at the tag deceased on the bag. Perimeta? Banks asked. He was leaning against the doorframe, nursing a dislocated shoulder. His voice rasped like sandpaper dragging over concrete. Clear, Wraith said. Her voice wasn't a voice anymore. It was a broken reed, a wheeze, forcing its way through a damaged larynx. For now. I walked to the table in the center of the room. The drive sat there, small, matte black, innocuous. It looked like a piece of consumer electronics you could buy at any strip mall for $50. But it felt heavier. It had a gravity that seemed to warp the air around it, pulling our eyes toward it. This object was the reason Vegas was crippled. This was the reason I had just falsified a military record. This was the reason we were now criminals in the eyes of the state. I reached out and touched it. The metal casing was cold, leaching the heat from my fingertips. You know what this is? I said. It wasn't a question. I was stating the tactical reality. Wraith looked up from her rifle. Her eyes were hollow, rimmed with red inflammation from the snow glare. It's the list, she said. Everyone they used. Everyone they erased. It's the receipt for the war. Erased ops. Black sites. Financial receipts. I pulled my hand back. The receipt. We had stolen the ledger of a shadow war. And the people who wrote that ledger didn't file police reports. They didn't send lawyers. They sent cleaners. They sent Mercer. We can't keep it, Banks said, shifting his weight. And we can't give it back? We're not giving it back, I said. The decision settled in my gut, cold and hard like the drive itself. I picked up the fake triage tag and looked at it one last time. Unknown female, The ink was dry now. Permanent. I looked at Wraith. You're dead. Lena. Officially, as of 0400 hours, the blast trauma makes visual ID impossible. The paperwork will sit in a queue for weeks. She nodded, slowly. She knew what that meant. No pension, no VA benefits, no flag on the coffin. Just a hole in the ground and a file that said, classified. She was accepting her own deletion. And us? Banks asked. He didn't look afraid. He looked tired. I looked at my own reflection in the darkened window glass. Dirty, bloody, eyes, sunken. I didn't recognize the man staring back. We're MIA, I said. Presumed killed in action during the recovery attempt, until we decide otherwise. I turned to the door. Outside, the wind was picking up again, howling through the valley like a mourning mother. But under the wind, faint and distant, I heard a sound. A rhythmic electronic ping from the repeater tower on the far ridge. The system was rebooting. The net was coming back up. The jamming had stopped because they didn't need to hide anymore. Now, they were hunting. Grab your gear, I said, putting the pen away. You're nobody tonight, and nobodies have to keep moving. The safe house was dark. We had killed the lights to save the battery and hide our thermal signatures from any high-altitude orbits that might be sweeping the grid. The only illumination came from the green glow of a chemical light stick cracked and thrown under the table. It cast long, sickly shadows that stretched and danced on the peeling walls like restless spirits trapped in a bottle. The air inside was stale, recycled, and heavy with the smell of wet wool and CLP gun oil. I sat in the corner, my back pressed against the cold concrete wall. My rifle was across my knees, a dead weight that felt like an extension of my own exhausted body. Top, check. My finger traced the safety selector in the dark. Safe. Semi? Safe. It was a nervous tick, a physical mantra to keep my hands from shaking. The adrenaline dump from the firefight had faded hours ago, leaving behind the shakes, the physiological crash of survival that feels like coming down from a bad drug. I reached into my pocket and popped a piece of nicotine gum. My jaw worked it mechanically, grinding the mint into a paste that burned the back of my throat. The sugar rush was the only thing keeping me awake. Outside, the wind hammered the metal roof. Bang, bang, bang. It sounded like footsteps, heavy boots on tin. Every gust made me flinch, my muscles locking up in anticipation of a breach charge. Every creak of the structure sounded like the safety clicking off a weapon. We were safe for the moment, but the psychology of the hunted had already set in. I closed my eyes for a second and ran the audit. The cost of doing business, the ledger of damage. Vegas was a shape on the cot, his breathing a ragged rhythm in the silence. Even if he survived the transport, even if the leg healed, he was done. The teams were over for him. He would never run again. He would never kick down a door again. That was the cost. Banks was a shadow by the door, his silhouette rigid, listening to the night. He had a wife in Virginia, kids who played soccer. He would never go home to them, not as the man he was. If he went back, and he went back to a court-martial or a quiet accident arranged by Mercer's people, that was the cost. And Kovic. She was a ghost in the corner. She had stopped cleaning her rifle. She was just staring at the drive on the table, her face illuminated by the green chem light. She had died for this country twice now. Once in Arlington, and once on that ridge. She had nothing left to lose because she had already paid the bill in full. I thought about my own career. 20 years. The trident. The pension. The identity I had built brick by brick. Deployment by deployment. All of it gone. Incinerated in a single firefight on a Christmas Eve that nobody would ever read about. I was no longer Master Chief Thorne. I was a liability. Was it worth it? I looked at the drive again. The little black box that held the truth. The truth was expensive. The truth had a body count. The radio on the table crackled. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't the hiss of jamming anymore. It was a burst of data. An encrypted squawk. Skrichat. It sounded like a modem shaking hands with a server. It sounded like a machine waking up. Mercer wasn't gone. He was just regrouping. He was calling in assets. Drones. Satellite. QRF. The machine was spinning up. I could almost feel the algorithm searching the grid, analyzing thermal pockets, triangulating the location of the repeater ping we had triggered hours ago. We weren't fighting a man. We were fighting a system, an infinite loop of resources that solved problems by deleting them. And we were the glitch. They're not going to stop, Banks whispered from the door. He didn't turn around. He was watching the tree line through the crack in the doorframe. No, I said. They're not. I stood up. My knees popped. My back screamed in protest. The muscles seized tight from the cold. But I stood up. Mercer thinks this is over, I said to the room. My voice sounded loud in the quiet. He thinks he flushed us. He thinks we're running scared, looking for a hole to hide in. I walked to the table and picked up the drive. I didn't put it in my pack. I slid it into my chest pocket, right next to my heart. I felt the hard edges against my ribs. He's wrong, I said. We're not running. We're repositioning. I checked my weapon one last time. Brass check. I pulled the bolt back a fraction of an inch. Seeing the glint of the brass casing in the chamber, it was ready. I was ready. I looked at Kovic. She met my gaze. Her eyes were hard, flat, empty of fear. She was ready too. She stood up, shouldering her rifle with a grimace of pain that she swallowed instantly. Ghosts don't bleed, she whispered. It was the only thing she had said in hours. And it wasn't a comfort. It wasn't poetry. It was a doctrine. It was the only rule we had left. We were dead men walking, and dead men don't have to follow the rules of the living. We didn't have ROE anymore. We didn't have chain of command. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were something else. Something off the books. Something that couldn't be bribed, bullied, or buried. I kicked the door open. The storm rushed in, a wall of white noise and freezing cold that scoured the stale air from the room. Let's go to work, I said. We stepped out into the white. The darkness swallowed us whole. The safe house was empty behind us. The files were gone. The tags were fake. And the hunt was just beginning. Near the end, Bravo, 6 echoed in my mind as the radio net call we had lost.